Great. Oh, hang on, consent to being recorded. So hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be here virtually at the Liverpool Evolutionary Anthropology seminar series. It's really nice actually to get this opportunity within my first few months working at the university to speak at the group, and particularly exciting that there can be more people with us today than would have been possible in the traditional in-person seminar format. So today I'll be speaking to you about my most recent project, and my presentation is called From Visitation to Intensification, a Demographic History of Palaeolithic Europe. And what with COVID and the cancellation of many of my speaking invitations this year, this is actually the first talk that I would have given that summarizes this project as a whole. So it actually seems very fitting that this would take place in my new academic home. So this talk today derives from a 3.5-year project entitled Palaeolithic Europe, a Demographic and Social Prehistory. And this was funded by a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship at the UCL Institute of Archaeology for the first 3 years. And that was followed by a Hunt Postdoctoral Fellowship from the Wenner-Gren Foundation for the final 6 months. And the primary outcome of this project is a monograph of the same name that is under contract with Cambridge University Press for publication in their World Archaeology series. I'll be submitting the final manuscript revisions to the press at the end of this month, so hopefully this will be out and available for you all to read and add to your reading lists by the end of 2021. And this project and the forthcoming monograph were primarily archaeological, but they were also multidisciplinary and combined archaeological, palaeo-anthropological, genetic and ethnographic data to produce the first long-term population history of Palaeolithic Europe, from about 1.8 million to about 15,000 years ago. And in this book, I examine the causes and consequences of demographic change and how these differed between hominin species. I present a new framework for the European Palaeolithic based around 4 demographic stages, and I do this all while combining evolutionary theory with a gender-aware and socially oriented approach to the Palaeolithic archaeological record. And it's primarily this new framework for the European Palaeolithic that is the focus of my talk today, but I will be touching on these other elements too briefly. So I'm quite often asked, why work on a long-term prehistory of Palaeolithic Europe that focuses on demography? And my answer to this question is always that understanding Palaeolithic population histories is vital for both from both a wider demographic point of view, so that is understanding humanity's long-term population history, but also crucial for improving our understanding of the Palaeolithic and the substantial social and cultural developments that occurred during this period, including things like the origins of art and symbolism and the colonisation of an increasing array of new environments. And in modern contexts, we see the influence of demography on a wide range of social variables, including the development of and variability in material culture, settlement patterns, social institutions, languages, as well as in personal decisions such as who to marry and when and how many children to have. And we can expect that demography was similarly influential, even in the deep past. And demographic processes are also central to human evolution. So evolution is driven by the propagation of genes through a combination of natural selection and genetic drift. And these variables are in turn determined by survival, so mortality, surviving to be old enough to have children, fertility, so having children, and dispersal or migration of individuals between and within populations. So Palaeolithic population history is also inherently tied up with the wider pattern of human evolutionary history. And while Europe is not the most important region of the world from an evolutionary point of view, the European Palaeolithic record has many benefits for this tricky task of studying Pleistocene demography. And these are benefits brought about firstly by the long history of archaeological research on the continent and the comparatively large available research budgets available, but also the temperate conditions that aid preservation and therefore have resulted in a disproportionately rich archaeological, fossil and genetic record. And the presence of good archaeological, fossil and genetic records is crucial here because it is the combination of these different data sources that really enables us to look at multiple demographic variables and take a kind of holistic perspective on demography in this early phase of prehistory. So before I go any further, I want to take this opportunity right at the beginning to thank my colleagues who have been instrumental in this project and the resultant book over the last few years. So this type of what I call a kind of analytical synthesis represented by the book really does stand on the shoulders of giants. So I'm really grateful to those colleagues who provided me with their expertise, information, support, encouragement, as well as inspiration during the long period of writing and research. And there are really too many to read out here, but they are all acknowledged in the book, and there are several of you in the audience today who are among those listed here. So I just want to say thank you. So, returning then to the central premise of this lecture, and that is this new framework for Palaeolithic Europe based around 4 demographic stages. So this image on the slide now summarizes this 4-stage model of the demographic history of Palaeolithic Europe. And throughout this talk, I'll be going through each of these 4 stages in turn. But just to give you a brief overview. So we have a general pattern of increased population sizes and densities across the European Palaeolithic. From about 1.8 million years ago, so that's hominins at Dmanisi, through to 15,000 years ago. So not quite the end of the Palaeolithic in Europe, but I kind of had to cut off the project and the book somewhere. And within this, I'm arguing for 4 distinct demographic stages that broadly correspond with existing archaeological frameworks as follows. So we have a visitation stage during the lower Palaeolithic associated with antecessor, Heidelbergensis and other large-brained middle Pleistocene hominins, and archaeologically with mode 1 and mode 2 technologies. We had residency during the Middle Palaeolithic, associated with Neanderthals, and archaeologically with mode 3 or prepared core technologies. We have expansion across the Middle to Upper Palaeolithic transition, associated with the earliest Homo sapiens into Europe, particularly those manufacturing or ignatian industries. And then finally, we have intensification across the Middle and late Upper Palaeolithic, associated with Homo sapiens and various Upper Palaeolithic industries, so Gravettian, Solutrean, Epigravettian, Magdalenian, etc. Now, there are obviously lots of regional and chronological specifics that have been glossed over within this overarching continental model, and I can't do justice to all of them in this talk. So I'm just going to focus today on the key ideas that underpin the model. And the first of these is that within this rather simplified pattern of growth in populations as we move through the Palaeolithic, there was actually a lot of variation. And I don't think either of those statements will surprise anyone who is remotely familiar with this record. So while we're used to seeing charts like the one I've put up here that suggest that Palaeolithic populations were rather static, they were actually very dynamic. And underlying this general pattern is something that looks a bit like this. So we have periods of rapid population growth followed by crashes, so peaks and troughs around an equilibrium. Now, thinking about the sorts of timescales on which these cycles of population growth and decline would have occurred, we don't really stand any chance of being able to identify them with the resolution available for the Palaeolithic record, even during the later stages of the Upper Palaeolithic, where this improves a lot and we have radiocarbon dating at our disposal. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget this underlying dynamism. And this is especially important for the element of this project that I don't have time to go to in detail here, but the bit that examined the causes and consequences of demographic change and looked at the limiting factors on population growth. So what could have caused these sorts of population booms and busts? And I've just put up there on the slide for you just a few suggestions as to what sort of things could have caused these types of population crashes during the Palaeolithic. The second key idea relates to the second part of the title of this project, and that is the notion of the social element of demography. So this social element is really crucial. As well, demography and demographic behaviours obviously have a strong biological basis. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, they also can't be divorced from their social context. And the key theme that runs throughout this book, and that I've interwoven into this 4-stage model, is the idea of Paleolithic populations as an example of what is referred to in the kind of anthropological literature as small-scale societies. And I'd actually been thinking about what this term would mean for my development of the social elements of my demographic prehistory for quite a long time before this article came along quite late in the project that really kind of sharpened my focus and shaped my thinking. And this is a paper that I put up on the screen that several of you are probably quite familiar with, by Douglas Bird and colleagues, called Variability in the Organization and Size of Hunter-Gatherer Groups. Foragers do not live in small-scale societies. So in this paper, the authors showed that while present-day populations of foragers might be small in size in terms of the on-the-ground number of people that you could count to create a kind of census and live in a given area, because of the flexible and fluid nature of group membership, it is not the case that a person in a forager group lives in the company of a handful of closely related people who comprise their small residential communities. Rather, instead, each person kind of interacts directly with hundreds, if not thousands, of other people during their lifetime through overlapping large-scale networks of interacting. And this is a finding supported by demographic research projects, on other forager groups. So this then leaves us with the question as to whether this was also the case for European Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. And my answer to this question in the book is for some and not for others. So I argue in this book that while all European Paleolithic populations were small, and we do have absolute population estimates for these populations that I'm not going to discuss in too much detail today, but even the largest continental population estimates for the late stages of the Upper Paleolithic do give us estimates for the whole continent equivalent to the size of the city of Leicester today, for example. So we have all European Paleolithic populations as small, but they were not all small scale. And in this model, the archaic hominin populations of the Lower and Middle Paleolithic were small scale in this truest sense, so living in groups composed primarily of close kin and lacking extensive social networks. But in contrast, regional Homo sapiens populations were much more interconnected at a wider spatial scale. And this shift was a key driver of change within the demographic prehistory of Paleolithic Europe, and it falls broadly at the division between the second and third stages, so between residency and expansion. And we'll come back to this later on in the talk. So let's look at some of the specifics of these 4 stages. So this is quite a whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid, and I'm going to start with visitation. So the visitation stage spans from about 1.8 million years ago, with the first occupation of the European adjacent area of the Caucasus at Dmanisi, and ends 300,000 years ago. So this then spans the European Lower Paleolithic, and these are the first 75,000 generations of humans living and adapting to this new continent as humans radiated out of Africa and into Europe for the first time. And in terms of demography, this is very much a stage of 2 uneven halves. So an early Pleistocene and a middle Pleistocene half that is really reminiscent of the long-standing debates of the 1990s about this long versus short chronology of the first occupation of Europe. And this is a framework that really continues to shape research into the European Lower Paleolithic today, albeit in a modified form. So an example of this that I've just put on the slide for you is the recent punctuated long chronology model of Rob Hosfield and James Cole. So here we have the settlement record of the very first inhabitants of Europe during the early Pleistocene, and this comprises fewer than 25 sites for this nearly 1 million year long period. And I've presented here what I consider to be the reliable sites dated to this interval, but there are very few hominin remains for this period, and we usually attribute sites as the result of human activity based on the presence of lithics. And the type of Mode 1 technology used by European early Pleistocene hominins can be really difficult to distinguish from naturally produced geofacts, especially in the types of secondary contexts that we find many of these sites in. Furthermore, in terms of thinking about the presence of people on the landscape and demography, our understanding during the European early Pleistocene of these elements is really hampered by the poor chronological resolution available. We can really only assign sites to these broad stages covering up to 200,000 years. So that basically means that we're treating lots of things as kind of contemporary when they probably weren't contemporary in the strictest sense, which has some quite obvious implications for our estimates or reconstructions of the number of people on the landscape. And these 25 European early Pleistocene sites share some key features, and these include a dominance of open-air sites, clustering in the south and southwest of the continent, with a notable absence of sites in mid-latitude Central Europe, and generally low occupation intensities at sites, as indicated by small lithic assemblages, as well as very few human remains dated to this phase. And again, what we do have cluster in the southwest of the continent. And these combine to suggest very small, low-density hominin populations across Europe at this time. This changes when we hit the middle Pleistocene, when the settlement record shows a marked shift that suggests an accompanying increase in human presence on the continental landscape. Particularly around 500,000 years ago, we start seeing an increase in the use of cave sites, a greater intensity of site occupation, more multi-level sites, more sites in primary context, and more hominin remains, including this large hominin fossil assemblage from Cima de los Huesos, which corresponds to the remains of approximately 30 people. And this occurs within an overall context of an increase in site numbers across the continent. We have about 94 sites dated to this interval, and most strikingly, a change in the overall distribution of sites across the continent, so that by the time we get to the end of the middle Pleistocene, from MIS 11 or so, we have a site map that looks like the one on the right here, which now sees increased settlement in Eastern Europe, and most notably, an increase in sites at those mid to high latitudes, including in those parts of Central Europe that were completely absent of people during the early Pleistocene. So we have this increase in the intensity of human presence and their distribution in Europe between the early and middle Pleistocene within this visitation stage. And a search for a satisfactory explanation for why we see this change is really ongoing, but we can look at evidence for other differences across the early and middle Pleistocene transition for clues. And I've just put some examples of these up here. So these include the benefits of the transition from a mode 1 to a mode 2 technology, other new technologies as well, so the increased use of fire, the replacement in Europe of the smaller brained Homo antecessor with the larger brained robust middle Pleistocene hominins, so Homo heidelbergensis, and early members of the Neanderthal clade might also be responsible for this shift. However, in long-term continental perspective, European lower Paleolithic populations are pretty much characterized by the same demographic regimes. Occupation was discontinuous, it was highly clustered, and people lived in small isolated communities even after the shift around 500,000 years ago. So demographic instability then really unites the two uneven halves of the population history of the European Lower Paleolithic. And following Dennell's and colleagues' source and sink model that I've put up here, and this model contrasts larger source or core populations based in refugia zones with smaller sink populations located in less favourable areas who cannot maintain an adequate balance of fertility and mortality, and who depend on migration from source populations elsewhere to avoid extinction. Europe in this stage is best characterised as a continental population sink throughout the Lower Paleolithic. So migration from elsewhere in the Eurasian landmass was necessary to sustain populations at the continental level, and the population history of the European early and middle Pleistocene is thus characterized by a pattern of repeated visitation. And this changes when we hit the middle Paleolithic, which marks the second stage of this demographic prehistory of Paleolithic Europe. And in this stage, over the course of about 260,000 years, or alternatively phrased, about 13,000 generations of Neanderthals, sustained occupation of the continent. So Europe was no longer one giant population sink. We have a known area of Neanderthal occupation based on the presence of morphologically or genetically diagnostic fossils of about 10 million square kilometers, ranging west-east from the Iberian Peninsula to the Altai Mountains, and then north-south from North Wales to Israel and Iran. And in continental perspective, we see at this time an increase in the intensity of human presence across the landscape, in the range of environments inhabited, and a change in the nature of sites. And these mark this continental transition from visitation to residency. So Middle Paleolithic archaeological sites number in the high hundreds. We're talking about stratified levels in the thousands, and the skeletal record of Neanderthals represents nearly 500 people. The Middle Paleolithic also saw the first hominin occupation of higher latitudes, so up to about 53 to 55 degrees north, occupation of the Eastern European plain, and of high altitudes. There was also an increase in the occupation of sheltered cave and rock shelter sites, and of sites that were repeatedly and frequently inhabited over multiple glacial interglacial cycles. And combined, these suggest a larger hominin metapopulation during the Middle Paleolithic than during the Lower Paleolithic. And we have much more archaeological sites, occupation levels, and fossil specimens dated to a much shorter time span. And this increase is above, I believe, what can be attributed to the better visibility and increased preservation of Middle Paleolithic deposits relative to Lower Paleolithic deposits because of either this greater use of sheltered sites or their more recent age. And I think this comparison between the Middle and Lower Paleolithic is particularly important here because there is this long-standing characterization of Neanderthals, in the words of Churchill here, as thin on the ground, with an especially small metapopulation living at a very low density. And this characterization is primarily a consequence of comparing Neanderthals to later Upper Paleolithic populations and recent foragers. Neanderthals essentially sustained residency of Europe for nearly 300,000 years. And all evidence suggests that the metapopulation was larger and denser than seen at any other earlier stage in the European Paleolithic, although they were still small in absolute terms. And again, I'm quite reluctant to put a figure on that, but we are still talking about small populations, but Neanderthals were not unique in this regard, and they were most definitely not the smallest in European Paleolithic demographic history. So having highlighted how they sustained residency, the Neanderthal metapopulation nonetheless fluctuated considerably throughout the Middle Paleolithic, with clear geographical and chronological variation in their presence. So we see a wider range of environments occupied, but we still have a strong north-south and east-west gradient in the spatial distribution of Neanderthal sites and fossils. And there's also a chronological bias in Neanderthal presence across the continent. So most Neanderthal fossils date to the last interglacial onwards, and most are of MIS3 age. And we see similar fluctuations in the settlement record as well, which suggests an increased Neanderthal presence in the late Middle Paleolithic from MIS5 onwards compared to the early Middle Paleolithic, so MIS 8 to 6. And in particular, we see a contrast between the long-term persistence of the Neanderthal metapopulation and smaller scale patterns of regular extinction of local and regional populations that are particularly noticeable in Northern and Eastern Europe, with regional gaps or hiatuses and reductions in Neanderthal presence, usually but not always corresponding with glacial stages. Now, in terms of this social element of demography, I propose that the visitation and residency stages of this framework are characterized by populations that were not just small, but also small scale. And by this, I mean that they largely lacked robust, wide-scale social networks that connected regional or local subpopulations with other populations within the metapopulation, and that they lived predominantly local lives interacting with a small number of probably quite closely related people. Where we do have evidence for these networks, so when they did exist, they seem to have been quite an infrequent occurrence. And the evidence for this comes from a range of different sources, including things like lithic transfer distances, isotopic analysis of individual fossil specimens that tells us about the size of territories, the limited evidence for aggregation sites, during this time that would have promoted face-to-face contact, and the general kind of paucity, if not necessarily the complete absence, of artifacts ideal for symbolizing group affiliations and relationships within extended social networks. And in terms of Neanderthals, perhaps the best evidence that at least some Neanderthal groups were very isolated, both geographically and socially, is the genetic and osteological evidence for inbreeding, so instances of people having children with their close biological relatives. Although I should say at this point, on the flip side, as I'm sure everyone here knows, we also have plenty of evidence for Neanderthals interacting and having children with members of other late Pleistocene hominin groups. So it's not quite so cut and dry there. And this should prompt us to ask then what the benefits of social networks are and why they are important. And hunter-gatherer and social networks facilitate the spread and exchange of information, ideas and resources, both within and between groups and individuals. So they function as safety nets in situations of local resource scarcity, providing knowledge about and access to a wider resource pool, and kind of ensuring a friendly welcome during face-to-face interactions with others, as well as functioning as a type of intergroup and intergenerational information storage. And in particular, they're often viewed as cultural mechanisms to cope with environmental uncertainty. So the temporal and spatial distribution of resources therefore strongly influences both the scale and frequency of interactions. So spatially extensive, well-connected and very robust social networks are particularly important to hunter-gatherer groups living in low productivity areas with highly seasonal environments, such as those that would have characterized the European mid to high latitudes throughout the Pleistocene. And in combination with other factors such as group size and composition, these social networks influence the evolution of notable social behaviors within the genus Homo, including intergroup tolerance and cooperation and division of labor, and socio-cultural change. But perhaps most importantly for present purposes, there are plenty of demographic benefits to these sorts of robust social networks. And studies of both humans and other primates indicate a positive correlation between the number and quality of social ties and individual reproductive success. So that's fertility and child survival, as well as with life expectancy. And it does this through this safety net that these relationships offer when resources are scarce or their availability is uncertain. So the development and maintenance of strong social networks helps to mitigate many of the demographic effects intrinsic to small groups that reduce both individual fitness, but also threaten the group's continued survival and long-term viability. And these include things like the increased susceptibility of small groups to random variation in births and deaths, as well as in the ratio of men to women, their increased vulnerability to extrinsic causes of mortality, such as famine and violence, the proportionally larger influence that the death of a person has on other group members, which can often be negative in terms of the loss of specialist knowledge and the availability of people to provide food, and also the small available pool of potential marriage partners, which might promote inbreeding. And this inbreeding with lower genetic diversity, it could reduce disease immunity and resistance and increase the risk of some inherited diseases. And this is an element of life in small and small scale societies that is very well documented for Neanderthals, for example. So I propose then that the widening of the scale of social networks by early Homo sapiens at the start of the Upper Paleolithic and the better maintenance of these relationships facilitated a key turning point in the demographic prehistory of Palaeolithic Europe. And this third stage of the demographic prehistory of Palaeolithic Europe is characterized by expansion in terms of both social lives and human populations across Europe with the arrival of Homo sapiens onto the continent. So at this time, we see in Paleolithic terms a fairly rapid expansion of Homo sapiens across the continent following their first arrival, as well as a general increase in occupation intensity and a larger metapopulation of expanding Homo sapiens compared to that of the last resident Neanderthals, who they ultimately replaced as residents of the continent during this third stage. And I will say at this point actually that the evidence for this expansion comes primarily from the archaeology, so from the site data and the settlement data. There is actually, quite strikingly, a real dearth of human fossils dated to this interval. And we also have lots of direct evidence for the social changes that I argue really facilitated this expansion. So during this third stage, we see a clear increase in maximum lithic transfer distances, and the movement of material and artifacts over long distances is more common. And particularly with the early Upper Paleolithic in Europe, we see the widespread appearance of durable, portable, standardizable and transferable ornaments, so usually in the form of beads. And these artifacts are often interpreted as markers of identity and group affiliation. And these combine to suggest that early European Homo sapiens populations lived in a much more outward-looking, connected society than their predecessors, coming into contact, either directly or indirectly, with a greater number of people and engaging more frequently with people outside of their immediate social group. And this expansion of both social lives and the intensity of occupation of Europe intensifies in the fourth and final stage of the demographic prehistory I'm presenting today. So, although, and you can see this from the graphs I put up here, the size of the European metapopulation fluctuated considerably during this stage, as a whole, in this fourth stage, which corresponds with the mid and late Upper Paleolithic, the population of the continent was the largest it had ever been. And we see populations thriving in a wider range of environments than we have ever seen them doing before. And this intensification was really aided by a diverse array of new developments. So in this stage, we see more robust mechanisms to maintain contact with other groups at the kind of supra and interregional level. So no European mid-upper or late upper populations were truly small scale. And between about 35,000 and 15,000 years ago, people really seem to have been integrated into social systems that connected them with others across the continent. And alongside this, we have people developing new forms of settlement, most notably the megasites of Central and Eastern Europe that come complete with formal architecture and formalized storage, alongside new, highly regionalized and rapidly changing forms of artistic expression and subsistence technology. Nonetheless, to bring us back to something I mentioned when discussing the visitation stage, both during this fourth stage and indeed kind of throughout the European Paleolithic, local extinctions and population turnovers occurred. And these were strongly influenced, if not completely determined by, the series of dramatic and often rapid climatic changes that we know characterize the Pleistocene. And perhaps the best example of this actually occurs within the intensification stage. And this is the demographic response to the last glacial maximum at the start of MIS2, which we know prompted a radical altering of the distribution of the European metapopulation, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, as the ice sheets reached their full extent. And the effects of this redistribution were quite wide-ranging, and we see them clearly reflected in subsequent human morphological and genetic variability in the final stages of the Pleistocene. So, I've just given you an overview then of this four-stage demographic model of Paleolithic Europe. So the big picture I developed as part of this project. However, this project was concerned not just with documenting long-term demographic trends, but I also kind of tasked myself with linking these trends in with prevailing models of social life in early prehistory. So the focus within the model I've just presented on this distinction between size and scale as it relates to social networks is one thread that runs throughout the book that links demography with social behaviours and social lives in the Paleolithic. However, in this kind of final part of the presentation, I really want to introduce you to some of the other kind of approaches and ideas that I explored in this project and in the book, and that I think are key to the development of what I like to call a social demography of early prehistory. The first of these is that I think it's crucial we work on getting a better understanding of what causes variation in demographic variables in the present day. And throughout this project, I've been focusing on what we can learn about this through looking at the demographic data available from recent hunter-gatherers. So I already discussed that actually a bit in terms of the social networks, but I'd like to look at a little bit more broadly at it now. And this is a subject that has been the topic of a recent collaboration between myself and my colleague Abby Page, who's on the screen there, from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Abby is an evolutionary anthropologist who conducts demographic fieldwork among the Agta hunter-gatherers of the Philippines. So demographic data on recent foragers are really most commonly used in Paleolithic and prehistoric contexts to supply absolute values for application to the study of past hunter-gatherers. So either as general descriptive estimates or as model input parameters for things like population size, density, mortality rates, fertility rates. And there are some issues with some of the ways in which this has been done, but overall it's a pretty reasonable approach, providing that with all these sorts of analogies, we are cognizant of the limitations. But in the paper up here that I've just published with Abby that resulted from this collaboration, we actually argue that the most useful role that data from recent foragers can play in reconstructing and understanding the demography of past hunter-gatherers is by focusing on looking for patterns of variation and what causes them in various demographic parameters, both within and between populations. And this is because, like in many other elements, there are huge documented variations in forager demography across lots of variables. And I've put a figure up here that just captures some of this variation in different forager populations across several variables related to fertility and mortality. And there are several reasons why recent foragers in particular might be the most useful populations to look at if we want to understand variation in present day demographic variables, with this eye towards improving our understanding of these in Paleolithic populations. And these include the idea that there are many demographic traits associated with foraging and mobility, as well as limiting factors that are common to the hunter-gatherer adaptation past and present that might be relevant in the past, despite the very different cultural environments between past and present foragers. And there is also this important commonality that both past and present hunter-gatherers are examples of what we call natural fertility populations. And underlying all of this then is this principle that underpins all research into past demography, and this is the assumption of demographic uniformitarianism. So this is a position best laid out in the work of Nancy Howell back in the 1970s, put that on the screen there, but it's also a concept that myself and Andrew Chamberlain from the University of Manchester have also just reviewed in a forthcoming paper. And the basic assumptions of this principle are that the basic biological processes relating to fertility and mortality are similar in the past as they are today, that they respond to variations in the social and natural environment in the same way, and that these similarities then act as constraints and impose limits on demographic behaviours. Now, this obviously comes with a caveat that this principle is not applicable in its strictest form to the archaic or non-sapiens populations of the lower and middle Paleolithic, who did differ biologically from Homo sapiens, but it can still serve as a vague check or baseline for demographic reconstructions and as a vague justification for the relevance of some of these data from recent foragers to Paleolithic populations. And in fact, the limits of the principle of demographic uniformitarianism in our evolutionary past is something that Andrew and I discuss in this paper if it is a topic that you're particularly interested in. And there's also, to aid with this, a pretty reasonable body of data on the demography of recent foragers, both in these sorts of specific, what I call demographic ethnographies, but also in broader compilations such as the Binford volume and the Kelly volume that I put up on the screen. However, using these data to help us understand past demography, and particularly looking at variation in demographic variables today and what causes it, really does require actually quite a deep dive into this literature, and quite a steep learning curve in terms of getting to grips with demographic terminology and methods. Now, I don't have time to discuss today the causes of cross-cultural variation in different demographic parameters in forage groups, but there is one element of this variation in particular that I would like to draw your attention to, and that links in really well with my drive towards this socially oriented prehistoric demography. And that is both the importance of women to long-term demographic trends and the importance of women's behaviour and living conditions, particularly as it influences their overall energetic condition on their fertility and on infant and child mortality. And I've summarised these relationships in the figure there at the top of the slide. And this is just an example, really, of another way in which the biological and social intersect when we're talking about demography. These relationships detailed in the figure up there are primarily due to reproductive physiology and its response to fluctuations and changes in energy input and output, but social and cultural behaviours and norms related to things like workload, mobility, access to food, etc., are also important determinants of overall energy status. And how we move from this sort of observation to making specific inferences about women's lives and behaviours that might lie behind archaeologically observable demographic patterns in prehistory is something that I developed both in this book, but also in this article up here that was published in Cambridge Archaeological Journal last year. So if you'd like to read a bit more about that, I can provide you with the details later. But my main takeaway point here then is this. As they are the main drivers of population trends and change, any long-term archaeological study of past population histories automatically places women and children at the centre of discussion, even if this is really very rarely made explicit. Any explanations of population change, past or present, must really be framed in terms of the factors that affect the fertility and mortality, and subsequently the lives and behaviours of these two particularly demographically important groups. And within this book, one of the things that I'm really trying to get across is that demographic approaches can really help redress a wider imbalance in the study of prehistoric societies, which usually and often completely incorrectly see women and children as marginal groups. And one thing you'll notice if you read the book is that I don't really talk about men at all in it unless I'm referring to specific fossil individuals. So there's very much this deliberate centering of women and children because of their important demographic roles. Finally, I'd just like to talk about how we as archaeologists and anthropologists talk and write about demography and the behaviour surrounding demographic processes in the past. And here I'd just like to recommend that we think a bit more critically about the language we use and some of the connotations, consciously or otherwise, behind them. And this issue of language isn't something that I'd really given much thought to before I embarked on a book-length project. But because of the sheer size of the task and the length of the time that I was working on the manuscript, and you start to obsess over your writing in a way that you wouldn't do for maybe some shorter pieces, I started to consider these things a bit more. And the specific issues that I'd like to highlight here are particularly relevant for demographic studies in Palaeolithic archaeology, but I think they're also kind of really relevant to everyone working on this period. And the first element relates back to one of the topics I touched on at the beginning of the talk, this difference in scale between the long-term demographic outcomes and patterns that archaeological demographic methods can document, and which is really the real strength actually of archaeological demography. But the contrast between that and the underlying behaviours that cumulatively produced such a pattern. And this is really an ongoing challenge. It's one that I think we as a community of people who work on these topics will continue to grapple with as new methodological tools are developed to help bridge this gap, things like complex systems approaches and agent-based modeling to build up from local demographic interactions and decisions to these emergent patterns. And I don't really have much to add to that, actually. But one comparatively easy adjustment, which I found very useful when working on this book project, has been to convert key time intervals into numbers of generations. And this is something you might have noticed me doing throughout this talk. And this, what I call generational thinking, is really relevant, particularly to demographic work, because the generation is the fundamental timescale of population dynamics. And when we use generations as our unit of time, it allows us to think a bit more specifically about the passing of time as it would relate to the lives and lived experience of prehistoric people. And it can also help us assess the validity of our explanations and interpretations of demographic events by converting these large blocks of time that are quite difficult for us to comprehend into much more tangible units. I also suggest that we need to think more carefully about some of the specific words we use to talk and write about demography and demographic behaviours in the past. There is a general trend of using some very dehumanizing language in prehistoric demographic research, which I really think puts up a barrier between us and the people we are talking about, and also inhibits a social approach to the study of past demography. And this may be more prominent in early prehistory than when we are talking about later populations, particularly among non-Homo sapiens or archaic hominins, but my sense from a wider reading of the literature is that this also occurs in other prehistoric contexts. So I've just put up here on the screen some of the key instances of these words that I think come across as very dehumanizing in these contexts, and the words that I think we should be replacing them with. And the last one actually here, I notice I'm running out of time, so I will speed up a bit. The last one here is my pet peeve. Bred, interbred, mated. These are not words that you use to describe people or the activities of people. Now, I know that some of these sound very clunky and they perhaps don't have the precision of the more technical terms that they replace, and that there are going to be some contexts where these words aren't appropriate, and the use of these other words on the left-hand side of the screen are kind of inescapable, particularly kind of bioarchaeological contexts. Nonetheless, I really do think the replacement of these terms goes very quickly a long way to make the past populations we're talking about seem more human and places them better within their social context, even if they are not quite so accurate and precise as these more formal biological and evolutionary terms. So I'm not advocating the wholesale replacement of them, but the more judicious use of these informal words. And I really think that these very biological, dehumanizing terms have been completely internalized by us. They're very much part of the default language that we use in prehistoric demographic research to talk about Paleolithic people. And I've just put up here an example of my own work that demonstrates this well. So this is an extract from the first draft of one of my book chapters discussing the direct evidence for causes of death among the lower Paleolithic Seminoles population. And I've just highlighted in red and underlined here the offending sentences. So language that, while technically correct, seem to prevent me from engaging with this demographic data in a socially meaningful way. And it's just a kind of stark reminder that these are people's deaths that we're talking about. And some of these words, when I came around to redrafting the section, did not sit well with me, particularly this reference to people in terms of their specimen numbers. So here then is the rewritten version. And it's not perfect, it's quite wordy in places actually, and the edits really added to that. But I do think that the minor changes have gone a really long way to humanize this discussion. So I've got rid of the references to females and males and people and members of a population rather than specimens. And some of the slightly more specialized terminology has gone. For example, the reference to maternal mortality at the end. I do use these specialized terms throughout the book, but I just think we need to take a bit more care about the context of their use. So this is very much a work in progress on my own part, actually. Every time I go back over my drafts, I find more examples of these little ticks that are slipped in. But I do think that this rewritten paragraph is a better representation of life and death in this lower Paleolithic community. And this adjustment of language is probably the most immediate, straightforward change that can be implemented as part of this drive towards a social prehistory. And as my final word, I want to say that the reason why I think this is so important is because when we talk about demography and demographic behaviours, what we are really talking about, what underpins the long-term patterns and these overarching frameworks like the one I've just described for you today, are some of the most intimate and meaningful events of human social and family life and the ties that bind people together. So childbirth, parenthood, kinship, sickness, death. And while the Paleolithic record is a palimpsest that is always going to be largely silent about these social factors and individual decisions underlying demography, I don't think this is an excuse for ignoring this aspect of Paleolithic population histories. We'll never be able to, learn about the marriage customs of Paleolithic groups or their cultural attitudes towards sex. But as I hope you've seen today and that my forthcoming book demonstrates, we can still incorporate social perspectives into the study of Paleolithic demography and kind of avoid reducing the behaviour of Paleolithic people to mere biological impulses against a background of an ongoing quest for food. So I think at times my interpretations might stretch the data somewhat, but I really do advocate for the sorts of leaps of faith I take within this project as a requirement to write a demographic prehistory that doesn't just populate the Paleolithic, but also peoples it. I'm going to finish it there. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. That was absolutely fantastic. So interesting. Yeah, thank you. So we'll go into the questions and answer session now. You see the chat?
Yes.
Okay, so Chris Stringer asks, we don't have many European lower Pleistocene cave sites with fauna. So how much is the ELP lack of cave occupation, lack of sites because of erosion?
Oh, well, I couldn't, provide any sort of quantitative estimate. I imagine quite a lot, to be honest. I don't really know what to do about it or what to say about that, but I do think that kind of the thing with the big 4-stage model is that small changes, or even actually in terms of the first one, quite large changes in the database aren't going to change the general pattern of those 4 stages that I've laid out today. So hopefully that would remain the same, even when we do start having a better understanding of the kind of taphonomic loss that has occurred and how that contributes to the settlement patterns. But I imagine it's quite a lot. There's a lot of references in the literature to scouring of these sorts of deposits that I think are probably skewing the picture quite heavily.
We've got a question from Akash.
Sorry.
So it says, just a random curiosity, given the older dates for lower Paleolithic sites and the difference in nature of occupation, in brackets, preference for open air sites versus later periods which have an increased occupation of cave sites, wouldn't the pattern observed be the result of preservation and site formation processes along with those of demography, especially given the historiographical bias towards studying cave sites and the long-term anthropogenic use of open areas, which affects the preservation of open air sites, along with the whole gamut of natural processes. So how can we account for these factors of preservation or lack thereof?
That's a great question, and actually one I did have to gloss over quite substantially today, the impact of site formation processes, taphonomy and research history on these continental wide patterns. I will say that they are very hard to actually formally account for. That's not something that I've attempted to do as part of this project, though I know, for instance, there are some things that you can do to try and assess this. I'm thinking of the kind of taphonomic correction curves of Brantingham and Sorrevell and people like that. In terms of the lower Paleolithic sites, I think quite a lot of some elements of the patterns are related to site formation and taphonomy. That big gap that we have in southeastern Europe, I think, will be filled up quite quickly with a bit more work, but also when we understand a bit more the processes of loss that have gone on over there. Some of the patterns, however, I do think are still demographically meaningful. And I'll keep on the lower Paleolithic because that's the question that Akash asked. But in the lower Paleolithic, that lack of kind of Central European mid-latitude sites is, I think, a real demographic pattern. I think that is a meaningful pattern that tells us about hominin tolerances and preferences during that time. So again, this kind of continental level approach to wide-scale long-term settlement patterns does have all of these caveats underpinning it, and the kind of task is to try and figure out which ones are demographically meaningful, or meaningful in terms of hominin occupation, and which ones are being skewed slightly. Both are in the mix.
Hugh Peters asks, speaking here as a complete lay listener, is it not the case that at some point in the large timescale you have discussed, human language evolved? How will we ever find evidence about this?
Oh, absolutely. That is a factor that is in the mix somewhere in there. Again, the question is really when and what is the evidence for this. One thing I do discuss in the book, and I kind of touched on it a bit here today, is whether differences in communication and language at the transition between those early Pleistocene Homo antecessor hominins and the larger brained middle Pleistocene hominins might lay behind some of the differences we see in their settlement and demographic records. Because while we do have some changes in terms of technologies and things like that, they don't seem to be quite as substantial as the change in settlement pattern might suggest. So one of the possibilities is that language could have been a key factor there. How we look at it is so variable. I know there are people in the chat actually who have a much better idea of how we would do that than me, but I will say, in kind of quick answer to your question, because a few others have popped up, that it's very controversial. People argue massively over when we see language as we would understand it evolving within this time period, and most importantly, which hominins we see it evolving within.
Anthony asks, in Paleolithic research, we can see a greater emphasis on variation in demography as a fundamental variable that explains a significant change, i.e. the appearance of facets of symbolic behaviour, the inventiveness or conservatism in technological or behavioural change, and so on. How long do you think we have to wait before we have genuine data for local population variability, geographically and or temporally, before we can begin to evaluate these demographic hypotheses?
I think we're getting there. I think a lot of people are really focusing on getting a proper handle on local population variability, which I actually think is the key to being able to formally test these models. My main kind of query surrounding all that is, once we've got that sort of data, whether it will ever be fine-grained enough for us to then be able to link it in with patterns of social change, models of social learning, and things like that. The disconnect between the scale at which the processes that we're interested in explaining happened and the resolution of the demographic data that we have for the Paleolithic, I think is going to be the sticking point there, to be honest. And I think that's why we're seeing so much of the tests of these sorts of ideas coming out from agent-based models or mathematical models and similar things like that. But my kind of contribution to this endeavour is trying to think of ways to create better databases of local population variability. So I'm hoping that we'll at least within the next 5 to 10 years or so be in a better position to at least have our contribution to that side of this research question improved.
John asks, do you think your approach might encourage us to think again about how human are some of the earliest species?
Yeah, actually I do. And I didn't kind of make it very clear, though it was kind of under there in this talk, that I approach this record with all Homo being classed as human and everyone's a different kind of human. One thing that I found really interesting that I've never actually been managed to include was this piece of work I read a couple of years ago by Holly Dunsworth about when in our evolutionary history hominins started to make the connection between sex and babies and where that is and how this kind of, I think she called it something like reproductive consciousness, is one of the key elements of being human. And I've always found that really fascinating and something that I'd really like to look into a bit more, because I do think that does have huge implications for the framework that I've broadly been writing in within this book. My assumption has been everyone as a human who is kind of a consciously aware of that link and then can make decisions about reproduction for themselves, but maybe that wasn't always the case. So I don't know, but I'd like to kind of switch the conversation a bit, I suppose, rather than emphasizing all the differences. I think it's quite nice to start with everyone being human, but a human of different types, and then building up from there. So that's the angle I've taken in the book, and I hope that that is an angle that comes across and, as John says, might encourage us to think again about how human some of the earliest species are.
Okay, we've got one last question from Chris. Recent evidence suggests Neanderthals and earlier humans had bigger rib cages and probably also bigger lungs and other internal organs. If they were more energy demanding, would that also affect the carrying capacity of the landscape for them?
I will answer that very briefly because I notice people have been leaving and Chris isn't here himself. Yes, absolutely. That is something that I developed very strongly in this book. I was very influenced by the Churchill Thin on the Ground volume. And as part of this kind of combination that I've been talking about between demography as a biological and a social thing, in addition to that social switch that I argued occurred around the transition between the third and fourth demographic stage, so the Neanderthal to Homo sapiens transition, I've linked in why that occurred with the difficulties that Neanderthals might have had in terms of keeping in contact and living in larger groups because of these higher energy demands and this reduced carrying capacity. Sorry. So that's very much a part of all of the wider arguments in the book.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Jenny.
And thank you for having me. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And you can find the recording of this talk on YouTube later on today. And we'll see you all next week. Bye.